The first time, my son-in-law looked at me like I was invisible. I told myself it didn't matter. The second time, I convinced myself I was imagining it. But the third time, he laughed at my accent in front of his friends. Something cold settled in my chest, and I finally understood that a quiet danger had been growing inside my own family. My name is Michael Carter. And for the last 2 years, I had been silently allowing my daughter to build her life beside a man who believed I was nothing. I stood near the marble pillar of the ballroom, holding a glass of sparkling water that had already gone flat while watching my daughter glow under crystal chandeliers. Her white dress flowing like light as she laughed beside her husband Nathan Brooks, a sharply dressed financial consultant whose confidence bent rooms toward him. The same man who had looked at my boots before my face when we first met, and who had never once called me by my name, only by what he believed defined me. 2 years earlier, he had stepped into our modest ranch house in Round Rock, Texas, scanning the old dining table, the framed family photos, the faded couch that had survived decades of dinners and holidays. And he had asked Emily in a tone that felt more like inspection than curiosity if that was where she grew up, smiling faintly when she told him I had built most of it myself, answering only with a quiet "that's nice," as though describing a handmade birdhouse rather than a man who had built a life from nothing. I had come to this country with 2 suitcases, a construction job, and an accent that made strangers speak slowly to me like I could not understand English. And I had worked, saved, invested, and built everything quietly by design. But Nathan neither knew nor cared to know any of that. And over time, his comments sharpened, steering conversations away from me, joking that I would not understand investments, introducing me to his friends only as Emily's dad who worked construction, slowly teaching my daughter, without realizing it, to soften her pride in where she came from. Standing in the ballroom that night, surrounded by silk dresses and tailored suits, I watched Nathan proudly introduce Emily as someone who had come from humble beginnings, as if she had escaped something, as if she had been lucky to leave us behind. And for the first time, my silence stopped feeling like protection and started feeling like betrayal. I walked toward the coat check where my leather briefcase rested, the same briefcase that carried documents I had never shown even my own daughter, deeds and leases and proof of a life I had built invisibly. And when I reached for its handle, I hesitated because I knew that once I opened it, nothing would ever be the same again. But then Nathan laughed loudly about ambition and said not everyone was meant to think big, and something inside me finally broke. I walked back toward him as he held court beside the champagne tower, his smile tightening when he saw me, brushing me off by saying they were talking about work, only to stiffen when I calmly told him I would manage. And when I asked about cap rates, property class, and downtown yields, I watched confusion ripple across his colleagues' faces while his confidence faltered, until I placed a single white business card into his hand and quietly told him I owned most of the district he worked in. The color drained from his face as he read Michael Carter, founder and managing director, Carter Holdings Group. And in that frozen silence, he whispered that it had to be a joke, just as Emily stepped closer, her voice trembling when she asked me what he was talking about. And I looked at my daughter, knowing that the truth had hidden for decades was about to shatter everything she thought she knew about her husband, her family, and the man she had just married. Asterisk. Emily's eyes stayed fixed on my face, wide and searching, the kind of look a child gives a parent when the world suddenly feels unstable. And in that moment, I realized how completely I had underestimated the emotional weight of the truth I was about to reveal. Because this was no longer about Nathan's arrogance or my quiet endurance. This was about the story my daughter believed about her own life. The story she had been slowly reshaping to fit into the narrow world her husband had carved for her. Nathan tried to recover first, forcing out a short laugh as he waved his hand dismissively and said, I was being dramatic. That anyone could print business cards and make bold claims at a wedding? And I could hear the relief in his voice as he tried to anchor himself back to the version of me he was comfortable with. The simple man who fixed fences and built decks and didn't belong in conversations about downtown acquisitions. But before he could continue, one of his colleagues asked quietly if Carter Holdings Group was the same company that owned several towers along Congress Avenue, and I nodded, feeling the room subtly tilt. The partner he had been impressing moments earlier stared at me with a calculating expression, and said she had toured a Carter Holdings property 2 months ago and had been told the owner preferred to remain private. And suddenly, Nathan's jaw tightened, as if he had just realized the ground beneath him might not be as solid as he believed. Emily stepped closer to me, lowering her voice and asking if this was real. And I placed a gentle hand on her shoulder and told her it was. That I had never lied to her, but I had chosen not to talk about my business because her mother and I had wanted her to grow up without a shadow of inherited success, to build her own life, her own confidence, and her own sense of worth. And as I spoke, I could see pieces of her childhood reshuffling in her mind. Late nights when I was working, weekends when I had to check on rentals, business trips that suddenly made sense. Nathan interrupted sharply, saying if any of this were true, he would have known. That no firm of his caliber would lease space from some unknown private landlord without his knowledge. And I asked him what address his office was on, calmly listing the square footage, the lease terms, the escalation clause, and the renewal windows. Watching his face pale as each detail landed exactly where it should, until his voice dropped into a whisper, and he asked how I could possibly know those things. I told him that property management is detail work, and that if you own buildings, you learn to know them better than the people who sit inside them. And that was when the senior partner he had been boasting to excused herself and returned a minute later holding her phone, confirming out loud that Carter Holdings was indeed the registered owner of Nathan's office building. And the silence that followed felt heavier than any sound. Emily covered her mouth, staring at me as if I had suddenly become someone else, while Nathan took a half step back, muttering that it couldn't be happening and that someone must be mistaken. And for the first time since I had met him, I saw fear behind his eyes. The music continued playing softly somewhere in the ballroom, but our small circle felt cut off from the celebration, as if we were standing in a separate reality where everything Nathan had built his identity around was cracking at once. He finally asked me why I had never said anything, his voice sharp and defensive, and I answered honestly that I had wanted him to see me as Emily's father before he ever saw me as anything else. That I had stayed quiet because I believed respect should grow naturally, not be forced by titles or money. But that my silence had been mistaken for weakness and used as permission to belittle my family. And I watched. Emily's eyes fill as she realized that every uncomfortable joke and dismissive comment she had brushed aside had been part of something much larger. Nathan tried to pivot, suddenly smiling again, telling his colleagues that this was actually wonderful news and that, of course, he had always known I was successful. But the false warmth in his voice fooled no one, and the partner simply nodded stiffly and excused herself again, leaving him standing in a shrinking circle of polite discomfort. Emily asked quietly if this meant that the building where Nathan worked belonged to me. And when I confirmed it, her voice trembled as she asked how long. And I told her 2 years, the same 2 years he had been introducing me as just a construction worker. Nathan snapped that he had never meant anything by it, that he was only joking, that he had been trying to keep things light. But his words rang hollow against the weight of everything that had just been exposed, and I could feel the air around him tightening with unspoken judgment. As he spoke, his confidence fractured further, and he finally demanded to know what I wanted, his tone shifting into something defensive and brittle. And I answered simply that I wanted respect. Not as a landlord, not as a businessman, but as Emily's father. As a man who had earned his life the hard way and who refused to be diminished in his own family. He opened his mouth to respond. But before he could speak, Emily stepped between us, her voice quiet but firm as she told him she needed a moment, and she took my hand, guiding me away from the champagne tower toward a quieter corner of the ballroom. Leaving Nathan standing behind us, watching as the story he had built about us began slipping out of his control, she asked me in a whisper how big Carter Holdings really was. And when I told her the approximate value, she swayed slightly as if the room had tilted, then asked why I had let her feel small for so long without correcting it. And I answered that I had never wanted her to feel small, that I had believed shielding her from our wealth would give her strength, but that I had failed to protect her from the way Nathan had been shaping her sense of worth. Her eyes brimmed as she admitted that she had started feeling embarrassed of her own background around his colleagues, that she had caught herself apologizing for where she came from. And hearing that hurt more than any insult Nathan had ever thrown at me, because it meant my silence had allowed someone else to rewrite my daughter's identity. Behind us, I could hear raised voices as Nathan tried to laugh things off with his colleagues, but the tone had shifted, and people were beginning to look at him differently, with curiosity instead of admiration. Emily squeezed my hand and said she needed air, and as we stepped toward the balcony doors, I saw Nathan watching us with an expression that was no longer confident but calculating, as if he were already planning how to regain control of the narrative. And I felt a cold certainty settle in my chest that he was not the kind of man who would accept being humbled quietly. The balcony doors closed softly behind us, muting the music and laughter inside the ballroom, and the cool night air wrapped around Emily like a shock to her system, making her grip the railing as if she needed something solid to hold on to while her entire sense of reality rearranged itself. She stared out over the glowing city skyline, her voice trembling when she finally spoke, saying she felt as though her whole life had been built on a misunderstanding. And I told her gently that her life was still hers, that her achievements were still real, that nothing she had earned had changed, but that the way her husband had framed her story had quietly chipped away at her pride, and that was something no amount of money could excuse. She admitted that she had started introducing herself differently at work, leaving out details about her family, changing how she talked about her childhood, and the confession cut through me deeper than any public insult because it meant my silence had taught my own daughter to shrink herself. Before I could answer, the balcony doors swung open sharply, and Nathan stepped out. His posture stiff, his jaw tight, his smile forced into something brittle as he said he thought we were done with this little misunderstanding. But his eyes betrayed him. Scanning Emily's face for reassurance that he could still control the situation, Emily asked him quietly why he had always made her feel like her family was something to downplay, and he immediately deflected, saying he was just trying to help her fit into his world, that his colleagues could be judgmental, and that he was protecting her. But the words rang hollow because they sounded rehearsed, like a script he had used before. She asked if he had known that my buildings housed half of his firm's offices, and when he admitted he hadn't, his tone sharpened, insisting that if I had been honest from the beginning, none of this would have happened, shifting blame onto me as though my privacy had somehow caused his disrespect. I told him calmly that honesty and humility were not conditional, that respect should not depend on a bank balance, and that his treatment of me and his subtle framing of Emily as someone who needed to be elevated were choices he had made freely. And his face flushed as he snapped that I had humiliated him in front of people who mattered to his career. That was when Emily finally raised her voice, not in anger, but in clarity, telling him that he had humiliated her long before tonight, that every time he introduced her as coming from humble beginnings, every time he softened his tone when speaking about her father, he had been quietly teaching her to feel smaller than she was. And Nathan stared at her as if he had never expected her to speak those words out loud. For a moment he was silent, then he reached for her hand, apologizing in a low voice, saying he had never meant to hurt her, that he loved her, that he was just under pressure. But the apology sounded thin, more like damage control than remorse. And I could see Emily struggling between the man she had married and the truth she was only just beginning to accept. Inside the ballroom, I could hear murmurs growing louder as guests whispered, glancing toward the balcony, sensing the tension, and Nathan noticed too, his eyes darting nervously as he muttered that people were starting to stare and that we needed to go back in before rumors spread. He stepped closer to Emily, lowering his voice, saying they could talk about everything later privately, and that right now she needed to stand by him. But the way he phrased it made my stomach tighten because it sounded less like partnership and more like command. Emily hesitated, then gently pulled her hand away and said she wasn't ready to pretend nothing had happened, and the refusal seemed to ignite something in him, his jaw tightening as he said she was overreacting. That everyone embellished at weddings? That no one would even remember this in a week? I stepped forward then, telling him quietly that the way a man treats his wife's family says everything about the way he will treat his wife, and that my concern was no longer about my pride, but about my daughter's well-being. And for the first time, his eyes hardened with something darker than embarrassment. He told me I was trying to turn Emily against him, that I was manipulating her with money and status, that I was angry because he didn't need my approval, And I realized in that moment that he was not afraid of losing respect, he was afraid of losing control. Emily shook her head slowly, tears sliding down her cheeks as she said she didn't feel supported, that she felt like she was constantly being framed as someone who had been lucky to marry him rather than someone he was lucky to marry. And Nathan's expression shifted again, a brief flash of panic crossing his face before he masked it with forced laughter and told her she was being emotional. The word hung in the air like an accusation, and I saw Emily straighten, something firm settling into her posture as she wiped her eyes and told him that dismissing her feelings as emotional was exactly the kind of thing he always did when she tried to talk about something that made him uncomfortable. The balcony felt suddenly very small, the city lights distant and unreal. And inside the ballroom the music swelled, oblivious to the quiet unraveling happening just beyond the glass. Nathan finally said he needed to make a speech to clear the air, claiming he would set the record straight and make a joke of the whole situation so no one would take it seriously. And before either of us could respond, he turned and walked back inside, leaving Emily staring after him with a mixture of fear and disbelief. She looked at me and whispered that she didn't know what he was about to do, and I felt a knot tighten in my chest because I had seen men like Nathan before. Men who could not tolerate losing face, men who would rather burn bridges than admit fault. I took her hand and told her to stay close to me, that whatever he was about to do, we would face it together. And as we stepped back toward the ballroom doors, I could hear the clink of a microphone being lifted and the first murmur of Nathan calling for everyone's attention. The sound of Nathan tapping his glass with a spoon cut through the music like a warning bell, and as conversations slowly faded, a hush settled over the ballroom, the kind that makes every breath feel too loud, while I stood beside Emily near the back, watching him straighten his jacket and lift the microphone with a smile that looked practiced but not sincere. He began by thanking everyone for coming, his voice smooth and confident again. And for a brief moment, it almost seemed like he might steer things back into safe territory. But then he glanced toward us, his eyes narrowing just slightly, and I felt that familiar tightening in my chest that told me trouble was coming. He said he wanted to talk about honesty, about knowing who you are, about being true to your roots, and I could feel Emily's hand tense in mine as his words took on a sharper edge. And when he mentioned how people sometimes pretend to be something they're not, how insecurity can make people tell stories to impress others, the room grew still, guests exchanging uncertain looks as they tried to follow where he was going. Then he did exactly what I had feared, turning his body toward me and gesturing in my direction as he said that I was a good man, but a simple man. Someone who had worked hard, but who didn't live in the world of high finance and downtown acquisitions, and that sometimes people like to exaggerate their importance to feel included. And a ripple of awkward laughter moved through the room like a weak echo. I felt Emily stiffen beside me, her breath catching as he continued, his tone sharpening, implying that the claims about me owning buildings and companies were just stories told by a father who wanted to feel important on his daughter's wedding night. And the words landed like blows, not because they were new, but because they were now being spoken in front of everyone she cared about. I stepped forward instinctively, but Emily squeezed my hand, silently asking me to wait, her eyes glistening as she listened to her own husband publicly rewrite her family into something small again. Nathan finished by raising his glass and saying that we should all know our place and be grateful for what we have. And scattered applause followed, hesitant and confused, the kind that happens when people sense something is wrong but don't know how to react. He lowered the microphone, clearly satisfied, and for a heartbeat the room hovered in uncomfortable stillness, and then I began walking forward. Every step toward him felt like crossing a line I could never uncross. And as I reached the podium, I gently took the microphone from his hand. Looking out over the sea of faces that were now watching with curiosity, judgment, and anticipation, I told them that Nathan was right about one thing, that respect is earned. But I added that respect is also lost, sometimes quietly and sometimes very publicly. And as I spoke, I opened my briefcase and removed a folder, holding up property deeds that showed ownership of multiple downtown office buildings, naming addresses, years, and values, watching as murmurs began to ripple through the crowd. I could see Nathan's smile falter as I continued, calmly explaining that I had worked construction for decades, that I had learned real estate from the ground up, and that I had quietly invested every dollar I earned, and then I lifted another document, explaining that the building where his firm had its offices was owned by my company, that his employer paid my firm millions in rent each year. And the silence that followed was so deep, it felt as if the entire ballroom had stopped breathing. Faces turned, whispers spread, and Nathan stood frozen, his expression draining of color as people began to realize that the story he had told about me for 2 years was collapsing in real time. I added that even the hotel we were standing in was part of my portfolio, that the celebration itself was taking place on property owned by my company. And that was when a visible wave of disbelief and murmurs swept through the room, some guests gasping softly, others leaning toward their neighbors to whisper. Emily stared at me, tears streaming freely now, not from shame but from something that looked like relief and heartbreak tangled together. While Nathan gripped the edge of the table as if it were the only thing holding him upright, I finished by saying that I had stayed quiet out of love for my daughter, that I had believed kindness and humility would be enough, but that my silence had been mistaken for weakness, and that I would no longer allow my family to be diminished. The applause started slowly, hesitant at first, then building until it filled the room, but through the sound I could see Nathan's expression changing again, not into humility, but into something darker, something sharp and resentful, and I knew that a man like him would not accept being exposed without trying to strike back. Nathan's hand trembled as he reached for the microphone again, and the ballroom, which moments ago had been filled with applause, fell into a tense, uncertain quiet, as if everyone sensed they were about to witness something irreversible. He laughed softly at first, the sound thin and brittle, and said he admired my dedication to the performance, but his voice cracked slightly as he continued, insisting that ownership documents didn't change the fact that I had raised my daughter in what he called a limited environment, and that Emily had only become who she was because he had introduced her to a higher world. And I felt Emily flinch beside me as if he had struck her with words. She stepped forward then, her voice shaking but steady, and told him that everything she had achieved she had earned herself, that her education, her job, her confidence had come from her own effort and from the values she had learned at home, and that she would no longer allow him to frame her life as something he had rescued. Nathan tried to interrupt her, but she didn't stop, telling him that his constant need to appear superior had made her feel small, that she had slowly started doubting herself, apologizing for her background, and even changing the way she spoke about her family, and that hearing him mock her father publicly had finally shown her that his love was tied to control, not respect. The room remained silent, every guest watching as Emily's tears fell, but her posture remained firm, and Nathan's face twisted between anger and disbelief as he accused her of embarrassing him, of choosing her father over her husband. But she answered quietly that choosing self-respect was not choosing against him, it was choosing for herself. He scoffed and turned to the guests, trying one last time to regain his footing. But no one laughed now, no one clapped, and the isolation seemed to hit him all at once as murmurs of discomfort replaced the earlier applause. Emily took a breath and said that she was leaving with me that night, that she needed space, clarity, and time away from him. And the finality in her voice made it clear that this was not a threat, but a decision. Nathan stared at her as if he were seeing her for the first time, then muttered that she would regret this, that she didn't understand what she was giving up, and I stepped between them, telling him calmly that no one who truly loves another person should make them feel afraid of their own worth. Security staff, alerted by the tension, moved closer, and Nathan backed away, his confidence finally collapsing into silence as he realized the room was no longer his stage. I guided Emily out of the ballroom, the heavy doors closing behind us, muffling the music and chatter. And as we walked down the marble hallway, she leaned into me, whispering that she felt like her heart was breaking and healing at the same time. And I told her that some endings are also beginnings, even when they hurt. Over the following weeks, she moved into a quiet apartment I owned near the river, slowly unpacking both her belongings and her sense of self, attending counseling, reconnecting with old friends, and learning to speak about her life without apology, while Nathan sent messages that ranged from pleading to bitter, which she eventually stopped answering. Months later, as legal proceedings began and her marriage formally unraveled, I watched my daughter rediscover her laughter, her confidence, and her pride in where she came from. And I understood that the wealth I had built mattered far less than the courage she was rebuilding inside herself. One evening, as we sat on the balcony of her new place, watching the city lights shimmer over the water, she thanked me for finally speaking up, and I admitted that my silence had been my greatest mistake, that I had believed humility meant staying invisible. But that true humility also means knowing when to protect your own family. I looked out over the skyline, over buildings I owned and streets I had walked for decades, and realized that the most important legacy I would ever leave had nothing to do with property or profit, but with the simple truth that no one, no matter how polished or powerful they appear, has the right to make the people you love feel small.